On May 3rd, World Press Freedom Day was observed. It was a United Nations General Assembly that had declared May 3rd as a World Press Freedom Day. The day serves as a reminder to the governments across nations to respect and uphold the right to freedom of the press and also the freedom of expression, which is enshrined under Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So what is the state of the freedom of the press in India? Is India a safe country for journalists? Can Indian media write and report stories fearlessly without being muzzled? Let's unbreak this news. According to the World Press Freedom Index brought out by the Paris-based Reporters Without Borders, India has fallen 8 places and is ranked 150 out of 180 countries that were studied. Last year, India's rank was 142. Why is this serious? Take a look at this image. The graph shows India's ranking on the World Press Freedom Index. A higher ranking on this scale indicates that the country lacks press freedom. Out of the 180 countries mapped, in 2016, India's rank was 133. In 2017, it further declined by 3 points and stood at 136. In 2018, 138. 2019, 140. In 2021, 142. And in 2022, 150. This essentially means that out of the 180 countries mapped, 149 countries fared better than India when it comes to press freedom. India has also been listed as a very bad country for journalists and for journalism. Over the years in these studies, India has figured as one of the most dangerous places in the world for journalists.
So indeed, India dropped by 8 points in the index that we just released. There are several reasons to explain this rather low score. One reason has to deal with the several attacks that journalists have to face. Physical attacks. India is still one of the deadliest countries for journalists in the world. Of course, you can report it to the very large population of India, but that's something that we take into account in our index. And in 2021, 4 journalists were killed because of their work in India, and the level of impunity for these crimes is very high. So that's a structural problem.
While India has steadily been faring poorly in the Press Freedom Index, the top 5 countries that have done well in the study are Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Estonia, and Finland, which are holding the top 5 positions. The worst countries are Myanmar, Turkmenistan, Iran, Eritrea, and North Korea, which are holding positions from 176 to 180. With India standing at 150, our country is just 29 points away from North Korea. Such is the dismal condition of press freedom in India, which is why during the World Press Freedom Day this year, Reporters Without Borders and 9 other human rights groups have asked the Indian government to stop targeting journalists and online critics for their work. These organizations have stated, amid growing restrictions on media freedom, Indian authorities have arrested journalists on spurious terrorism and sedition charges and have routinely targeted critics and independent news organizations, including raiding their workplaces. Journalists and online critics also risk prosecution under the Information Technology Act and IT rules of 2021 for content critical of the authorities. Indian authorities have been implicated in using the Israeli-produced spyware Pegasus to target journalists. In addition, the authorities' frequent internet shutdowns hamper the ability of journalists to do their work, including accessing and disseminating information online. So should we take these reports seriously? Is it just 1 or 2 organizations that are talking about India's declining press freedom? In fact, several international organizations and groups have reported at length on India's dwindling press freedom. In a human rights report brought out by the US government this year, India has been red flagged and termed as a country where the media is being pressured or harassed by the government. The report states, the Constitution provides for freedom of expression, but it does not explicitly mention freedom of the press. The government generally respected this right, but there were instances in which the government or actors considered close to the government allegedly pressured or harassed media outlets critical of the government, including through online trolling. There were also reports of terrorists and extremists perpetrating killings, violence, and intimidation against journalists critical of the government. That apart, In the Freedom House's Freedom in the World 2021 report, India was downgraded from free to partly free status due to a crackdown on expressions of dissent by media, academics, civil society groups, and protesters. The Freedom House report stated that the Indian authorities used security, defamation, sedition, hate speech laws, and contempt of court charges to curb critical voices.
India holds the most complicated elections, but that doesn't make it a democracy. India has newspapers which are published, but that doesn't mean the press is free. India has rule by law and courts, but doesn't mean it's a rule of law. It is a parliament, but it may not have an opposition. If the opposition exists, it is pretty much in name. So it has the structures of what we see as a democratic society, but the functions have been drained away.
The list of such reports does not end here. The Human Rights Watch World Report of 2021 had stated that the BJP-led government increasingly harassed, arrested, and prosecuted rights defenders, activists, journalists, students, academics, and others critical of the government or its policies. The government continued to impose harsh and discriminatory restrictions on Muslim-majority areas in Jammu and Kashmir since revoking the state's constitutional status in August 2019 and splitting it into two federally governed territories. Many international reports like these have discussed how Indian media is being silenced and muzzled by the government in power. So it is not just one or two groups or agencies that are talking about the state of the Indian media. But the Indian government has consistently rubbished these reports and has called most of these reports motivated and agenda-driven. While the government continues to turn a blind eye to these reports, many believe the reason for the poor state of the Indian media is also financial.
There are several reasons for this. One important reason is purely financial. What we see is across the world and also in India, the old media or the traditional media or the legacy media, the advertising revenue from private organizations has not gone up, often stagnated. In many places it's come down, and this trend has been exacerbated during the pandemic. But that's true for India as well. And people are yet to devise ways to, those who read on screens and not on pieces of paper, how to monetize that content. But what's different about India is that there is a growing dependence on government advertising and government sponsorship. And that is one important reason why such a large section of the media in India is not asking difficult questions of those who are in power. And in fact, he who pays the piper calls the tune. So they are singing the tune of the government in power. They are not holding truth to power, not asking difficult questions, not asking questions.
One of the problems plaguing the Indian media is the ownership of our media houses. We are one of the world's most populated countries. We also have a very densely populated media landscape. But the enormous diversity that we see in our society is barely reflected in our media organizations. There is a concentration of media ownership amongst a selected, powerful group that comprises a few individuals. That seems to be one of the biggest problems facing the media industry today. For instance, rich people in business and huge business groups have a monopoly over major media organizations. Let's take a look at RIL for instance. RIL Chairman and Managing Director Mukesh Ambani, in his statement delivered at the 42nd Annual General Meeting of the company, had said that the 72 television channels owned by Reliance Industries have a reach of 800 million Indians, and this represents 95% of the TV viewing universe. Not just RIL. Let's take for instance Asia's richest man Gautam Adani. Adani is also following the Mukesh Ambani route. And if media reports are to be believed, he is scouting for Indian media assets and is looking at setting up and expanding his media base in India. The Indian media landscape has been massively expanding. Today there are more than 100,000 registered newspapers and magazines in India. And India has close to 400 news channels. But the fact is, most of these news organizations are unable to practice independent journalism out of financial constraints or pressure from the government, both at the center and at the state level. The mushrooming independent digital media outlets in the country, many of which are not dependent on government ads for their revenues and those that are following the people-funded or the subscription model of news, these alternative news media organizations today are providing a glimmer of hope to millions of Indians who want news that is unbiased, independent and fact-based. But such independent journalism can only survive and thrive when the citizens come forward and pay for news. The World Press Freedom Day is not just a reminder to governments to uphold the freedom of the press, but it is also a clarion call to the citizens to do their bit to support independent news media organizations that are holding people in positions of power accountable, to uphold and maintain democratic values in the face of pressure, threat and attacks.